Welcome back, everyone. I have today three special guests, all of whom are PF coaches at the Argument Institute that we're incredibly happy to have, all of whom have incredible amounts of experience in public forum debate and debate in general. So maybe each of you can introduce yourselves briefly.
Okay, hi. My name is Ava. I debated for the past 4 years at Blake in Minneapolis. I won like UK, Apple Valley, Emory, some round robins, and I'm super excited to be working with the Argument Institute.
Hi, I'm Fiona. I debated for 4 years at Carey Academy. I semifinaled Yale, the Harvard round robin, and I mainly read Cade's.
Hi, my name's Ishan. I competed at Strake Jesuit, and now I coach there. As a competitor, I finaled the TOC, and got a whole bunch of bids. And as a coach, most notably, my team won the TOC the last couple of years. And I think above all else, I've been featured on a Matt K's video before. So.
Well, that will be true for all three of you after this goes. So, yeah. But yes, it's such a high accomplishment for sure. So today we want to talk about two major things. Before we get into talking about the new topic, I actually want to talk with all of you about the old topic and what has happened at camp the past few weeks, the past month or so. Because all of you have some familiarity with what happened at camp. Either you were instructors or you know people who attended. And so the first question that I have to ask is just like very generally, how do you think PF is shifting as evidenced by the camps that you saw? And then we'll break off some like organic conversations from there.
Well, I didn't go to camp, but just in general, I think the circuit is shifting to be more progressive in the sense that people are reading more Ks now, and not just non-topical Ks, but actual like true like topical critiques. I think the next step, honestly, for PF would be reading theory, but not like theory in terms of like frivolous theory, but like serious theory, like evidence ethics, author qualification, hyperlinks. I could potentially see a case for citations too, as like that becomes more popular, and maybe having to disclose sites now. But yeah, I think that's like the shift I kind of see in general. And my kids at camp have told me that there's a lot more, for example, argumentation surrounding settler colonialism now than like in the past.
That makes sense. Yeah, it seems like there's a big shift toward Ks specifically in progressive debate. I've noticed, let me know if this is actually true. I've noticed, I feel like there's a shift away from theory a little bit that has happened in this past year or two.
I think that is true. I know like one team, like Masterman last year, they ran a lot of frivolous theory. I know that, but I'm not talking about like theory like Ed Sheeran theory or like must disclose Spotify, things like that. Like I'm thinking like more like towards like evidence ethics or like T even, like TVA, TVN, or you must defend a specific definition or you don't meet, things like that. Like I think that might be more popular, especially because this current topic is a little bit vague on like what the implementation would look like.
Yeah, so mine isn't about progressive debate. But I think that what I observed is that the circuit is definitely getting very blippy. Like there were plenty of teams when I was at NSD who were reading like six contentions, and I was like, oh, I don't know if everything that you need for an argument is here. And I think I've seen a lot of teams that have been not very willing to kind of attack those where it seems most plausible to me in terms of just being like, there's no internal link, like move on. So I think that there's been kind of an explosion of very unwarranted arguments. I've also similarly seen, so in my opinion, the best way to have dealt with like the France topic was to just get very good at like the stock Russia deterrence escalation debate. I think that if you get good at stock on pretty much every topic, make it nuanced, you're going to be able to win like 90% of rounds, and you can just like apply the thesis level and win pretty much everything. But I saw a lot of like racing to the margins. And then I think the last thing I saw that people are going to need to start dealing with is the popularity of time frame weighing, especially on the neg. I think there were a lot of neg teams who were pretty much unbeatable because they would just say, our time frame is immediate, it's perceptual. That was pretty much all, and judges would be like, yep, pull the trigger there. So yeah, I think those are some of the ways I saw like substance PF evolving at camp.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like this is one of those weird differences that's been happening across the past few years for me, is that now every AF team is using try or die weighing and every neg team is using time frame weighing, which is not really something that happened before. And I wonder if anyone has thoughts on like how people can deal with this or why this might be, I don't know, like logically problematic in some way.
Guess I can share like first my thoughts on it and then maybe a little bit about thoughts about dealing with it. I think that like generally a way to look at like the way people are writing arguments now is that they kind of have like a goal in mind for what they want to do with it. So like in the case of like an argument with a quick time frame, like they're like we're looking for an argument with a quick time frame and we'll settle for like whatever mediocre piece of evidence gets us there. Or we're looking for something that like we're looking for a problem that's going to occur in like I don't know like a few months and that like the resolution can maybe affect because then we have try or die. And so it seems like those like things are coming first and it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. And so that's I think something that I've noticed quite a bit. Like every neg team is going to want a fast extinction argument. Every AF team is going to want a problem that's really big and immediate. So that definitely exists as well. As for like dealing with it, I think that like first on the merit of it, I think a lot of people concede claims that I don't think are like reflected in evidence. Especially when people claim that their arguments are immediate or that they're happening very quickly. And so I think like if you don't want to go the route of like, denying the like the obsession with time frame and try or die or whatever, which is like okay, whatever, sure. Maybe you want to play that game too. I think you can at the very least question whether or not people are actually proving the points they're claiming to prove. And I think that comes with like close inspection of evidence, and just like logically working things out. I think something that a lot of people forget is that a lot of the time, like, an app team will say, oh, here's a problem that's going to happen in like a couple of months. Like there's a recession that's going to happen in like 2 months or whatever. And then they'll say it's try or die. Everyone's going to die in 2 months. But I think a lot of people miss the fact that like, time frame isn't just one individual part of your argument, especially if you're it's the sum of your argument. So like when that recession actually kills everybody, for example, and you also when you stop it. And so like I think one thing that's very helpful and just in terms of like a mindset perspective in that sense is like just literally create two worlds in your head. The status quo and the world where the resolution takes place, and just play the arguments out. This is always how I like look at debates, or try to conceptualize them and then try to judge them, and just like see like which world is better. But also, I think it helps with just like recognizing that like if you win one piece of information, it doesn't necessarily lead down the time frame or try or die roads. And then of course, I think there are like things you can do to contest like the merits of whether or not these like considerations are real or whatnot. But I'll let some other people say some stuff and maybe circle back to that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I've seen that teams, something they should be doing a lot more is definitely like preempting them, especially because in pretty much all the debates I saw, like it was just going to come down to try or die versus time frame. I think the teams need to start kind of preempting that like in rebuttal and explaining like here's why either try or die is like invalid or why their impact isn't actually that quick. Same with time frame, right? I think like a lot of the time AF teams would kind of just be like, okay, we're gonna like link turn it, which like that's cool, but there needs to be time frame weighing under your link turns and just like reasons why their scenario doesn't happen quicker. I think that sneaking like weighing under turns is probably like the best thing that teams can be doing when they're on the AF, just because I think a lot of the time that's something that goes like undercovered when teams are frontlining. So I think that just like being aware of if you know that this is the way the debate is going to go and there's really every reason to believe that at this point, how do you make like your front half set you up optimally for that?
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I think that there are probably a lot of different ways that you can do this. Like generically, maybe there's just like responses to time frame weighing or responses to try or die weighing. My intuition is that it might be difficult to respond to one while still leveraging the other, because I think that the reason that each one is powerful depends on some assumptions that they kind of share. Like for example, if I were trying to respond to time frame weighing, I probably would point out that like the evidence does not say that this is 100% going to happen or something. And therefore, even if it does come first, if it, has like it doesn't have a 100% probability, and so it might not matter the most that it comes first. I would take, for instance, a deal that said there's a 10% probability that everyone dies if I push a button now. But if I push the other button, then there's like, there's a 90% chance that everyone dies in 10 years. I definitely would push the 10% button or the 10% button instead of the 90% button because like the difference in probability is so much bigger than the difference in time frame, which seems almost insignificant at that point. Even if it's like a 10% versus 11% difference, it seems like I still push the 10% button over the 11% button, given how important it is for us to maximize, I don't know, like human survival, right? The math seems to work out from all the extinction calculus anyway, that like time frame should not be a very important consideration, especially as it's used as this the weird prerequisite. Like that totally assumes the binary of arguments that like it happens with 100% probability. But on the flip side, I think that try or die weighing also assumes this, right? Like try or die weighing is just assuming it on the uniqueness instead of the link. It's just saying that there's a 100% chance that this will happen in the future unless we vote AF. And so it's hard to dispute the assumption of 100% link without disputing the assumption of 100% uniqueness. And in reality, probably both of those assumptions are wrong. So there's this weird strategic dilemma where if you want to use this strategy, which is very popular and clearly wins a lot, then you can't really refute their version of the strategy. So you have to just like beat try or die by saying that their uniqueness is wrong instead of beating try or die logically by saying it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think one thing that can kind of help with this, and we've talked about this somewhat before, is just like when you conceptualize the scale of the impacts, like a lot of people, like every like, national circuit impact, if it's not like structural violence or something, it's leading like all roads lead to extinction. And so because of how vast that is, right? Like I think you're talking about like, a 10-year difference. Like that really isn't. And if you're taking like a sort of outsider neutral perspective, like an expected value perspective almost, which I think is probably better, like the better way to evaluate a decision, than letting like all sorts of like biases creep in. But if you're evaluating just like the timeline of like I don't know, like humanity, I guess, or just like living species as a project, then like 10 years really isn't significant. And it seems like the differences in probability, like from an expected value perspective, just matter far more. But people kind of leave behind the scale of their impacts just because we've become kind of numb to it, I would say. Just because again, like every impact is extinction in debates that aren't anything else.
So Ava, you mentioned that there's a lot of blippiness in general with like lots of assertions and claims being thrown around without a lot of warrants. I'm wondering how teams currently are going about addressing them, and how you think people should start addressing them.
Yeah, so I think what I've seen is just a lot of like being blippy back. I know when I was judging rounds, I was like, oh my God, like how do I decide these, right? It's like there's seven contentions or nine contentions total, and it's super unclear how anyone actually wants me to vote. So I think people, first of all, need to be cognizant of the fact that like your judges don't enjoy these kind of debates. And that's not to say that I don't want to judge like a technical debate with a lot of good argumentation. I would love that. But if you're not explaining anything, like it just becomes very difficult. And there's so much more thinking, and there's also so much more opportunity for intervention in maybe ways that you don't want. So, like, first of all, just like please, if they're being super blippy, don't just be blippy back because the decision is probably not going to be something that is as predictable as you would like it to be. I think to be honest, there needs to be more calling out of just like, okay, there's no warrant read for this. They don't have an internal link. And I also think that judges need to be a lot more willing to hold the line. What I observed at NSD is there's a lot of judges who are like flowing off the dock, or they're just like kind of letting gaps be filled in the back half because a warrant like seems intuitive to them. I think especially with first year outs, like it makes sense because those are things that we all did when we were debating. Like, I wasn't like flowing totally by ear when I was a debater. But I think the judges kind of need to say, like, okay, for the sake of the activity, I just need to like, here's what I flowed initially, not going to let people fill in the gaps and be a little bit more like confident in that.
Yeah, I like agree with the majority of Ava said. Like the only thing I would be kind of questionable about is like making judges hold the line, just because I think that should be up to the competitor to point out the fact that they're being blippy, that there's no warrants in their arguments. This is the same take I have when it comes to, for example, bringing up new warrants in like I don't know, after second summary, right? Like if you bring up a new warrant or new piece of evidence, it's up for first summary to check, not sorry, first final to check back on that and call them out on that. Like I'm not going to automatically write off this response just because I know that it's new. Um, Obviously that doesn't apply for second final, but in that case, like it's the same thing. Like you should point it out if it's new. I think it's just the same thing here. Like if there's no warrant, if it's blippy, you should point it out. And the only reason why I say this is because I would be scared, like just how like judges would fill in the gaps. It's kind of similar here. Like judges will decide that this is not warranted enough and then drop you for it, which is also equally unfair if there was actually truly there was like warranting in the first place. So I think honestly, like what Ava said was right. Like competitors should just point out that there is something blippy and that this is not warranted well and there's no impact.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, that I'm not saying that the judges should like without the competitors bringing it up be like, no, like this is Blippi. That wasn't my point. What I'm just saying is that like I think a lot of the time there will be a team who reads something Blippi, the opponent gets up and is like, there's no warrant. And then the team is like, yes, actually there was a warrant. It's in like this piece of evidence, like this is what we've been saying all along. And the judge is like, oh, well, like if it was in like that card, like, and even if it wasn't like red, they'll just kind of be like, okay, like I guess. I think that there needs to be just a little bit of like a higher burden in terms of like what explanation actually is sufficient. And I think competitors definitely do need to do like a better job of exploiting it and actually being willing to like go for those as arguments.
Yeah, what I'll say is like I think from a competitor perspective, it's I think difficult to, muster up the courage to just say this was a claim without a warrant. And I think that's like because like what if the judge disagrees with you, then like you're screwed, right? Because like then the blip stands, I guess, and it's a response. So I think there is an element of like judge responsibility here, which is I think judges should be like more clear about like what their standards for warrants are. And I think competitors should also be more willing to throw out those claims, but it's like a two-way street, right? Like if competitors just throw out those claims, but like judges aren't willing to receive them, then those blips do become effective and strategic. And it's tough, right? Because I do also understand the fact that this is a very time-limited activity. It's really difficult to make a list of like four arguments. And so like I do get the rush to making shorter arguments. I think something that maybe people need to realize is that like shorter doesn't always equal blippier. I think you can fit warrants into shorter statements and sentences, but those warrants actually need to be there. I mean, I think also maybe more important than that, they need to be flowable. From like a judge perspective, if someone is saying something for one sentence and they've packed three warrants into it, you're probably not going to catch all those three warrants. And maybe you do one time, but over the course of like 10 different arguments, like it probably isn't humanly possible to at a high enough speed. And so like, I do think like you can make shorter arguments, and I think like judges can appreciate shorter arguments. But there does need to be a level of like debaters being willing to call out a lack of warrants. And then like I think something that I've been told is very strategic is just like say that there's a lack of a warrant, and then throw out a counter warrant. For whatever the warrant was missing. And I think generally that's a pretty safe way to deal with something like that because like no warrant plus you have a counter warrant and like then there's less gray area.
100%. I'll say three quick things. One, I have a video on this subject, actually. I don't remember what it's called, but it's like, it's one of the five things you don't learn at camp thing, where I explain how maybe you can call out no warrants better. Two is a bit of a rant here. I completely agree with all of this. I think it actually goes back to what we were talking about prior die and time frame as well. There seems to be this weird dilemma with all of this where it would be great if competitors called out the other side for not having warrants or for making illogical arguments. But if they do that, then they lose all of their illogical arguments as well. And it seems like in the national circuit, competitors in technical debate are so used to using these strategies that it's like the transition cost of shifting away and starting to call them out instead of using them when you know that no one else will call you out is very high. I think there's a very high cost. There's a very high like energy input you need to put in to be the first one to actually start calling this out. But I also think that there's a very high reward for doing so. I actually think that like if you just run one argument, it's like the most stock contention, but you actually call out the logical fallacies and like all of these assumptions. And if judges are receptive, which is a big if, because a lot of judges might just assume against you because of norms. I think if judges are receptive to that, it's actually an incredibly powerful strategy because no one will know how to deal with it. Like no one is doing this. No one is calling out each other for not having sufficient warrants in a coherent fashion. No one is calling out the fact that tri-die and time frame weighing really doesn't make sense, or that arguments, can also have different probabilities that are not 100% or 0%, which are all assumptions that I think are required in a lot of these technical rounds today. If you dissect those assumptions and you don't yourself rely on them, I think you can actually beat a lot of these teams without them actually knowing what will happen. So there's a big strategic hole that you can fill. The third thing I want to say is there's something weird going on with no warrant claims and like missing piece claims in general, which is that I think they function in a different way than a normal response or than a normal argument. in that they're kind of like an observation instead of a response. Like you don't answer them in the same way, and they seem to take on a different function in the round where like you could maybe say them in different speeches or they're up to the judge to interpret, right? Like you could say no warrant, and just because they dropped that they didn't have a warrant doesn't mean the judge will necessarily vote as if they didn't have a warrant. Like usually tech judges, even the most tabula rasa ones, will like evaluate the truth of that claim. Like if they did actually have a warrant, then they won't vote for you by if you just say no warrant. So and that makes sense because you want to avoid kids just spamming like, oh, they didn't have a warrant for this or this or this or this or this. And I've gotten into these weird situations recently where like one team calls the other team out for not having warrants, but it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black, and like they also don't have warrants in the exact same fashion, like the exact same line would they would not cross as well. So I was wondering what you guys think about like what judges should do about that and what competitors should do about that as well.
I mean, I think the most obvious answer is just like competitors should start having like warrants, right? Like I think that for judges in that situation, it's definitely tough. Like I don't really know what I would do. I mean, I think if the team didn't point out like, okay, you yourself don't meet this threshold, I would probably like still like vote for the team that's pointing it out because I'm not just gonna like give you like all of these no warrant claims if you don't make them and if you don't recognize that that's like strategic. But in a world where like both teams are doing it, like I don't really know what happens. I think they would probably just like either it's like presumption, which I hate. I think voting on presumption is like fake and like really not needed most of the time, but like maybe you presume, or maybe it's just like independent of the warrant debate, like who's actually winning their argument on like offense, defense. But yeah, I think that debaters just need to be willing to like actually like read warrants in the first place. I don't think it's like that challenging. And it means that like these close rounds where the judge doesn't know what to do, like pretty much 100% of the time get resolved in your favor. So mathematically, it seems to just like make the most sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Ava on this. I truly do think it should be the competitor's burden, not my burden. My burden is to evaluate who won the round. I shouldn't be like checking back for what I think debate should look like, if that makes sense. But yeah, I totally agree with Ava on how I would evaluate that round. I probably would just vote for whoever pointed it out, and if it wasn't pointed out again by them, then who cares? But actually, Mac, you said something really interesting that I thought should be talked about a little bit more. You mentioned how like a lot of times like judges would have like internal biases. And I think that's honestly kind of true. Like, for example, like, even if like the most tabula rasa judge possible, right? If they debated, I don't know, like theory back in high school and they really enjoyed theory, then they're probably more likely to vote on theory if the debate becomes messy. And that's something I think like competitors should become like more wary about. Like, if you make the debate messy enough for a judge and that judge like likes to err a specific way because that's how they debated in high school, like even if it's not intentional, that's what your bias is going to be like because that's just how you debated in high school, or that's how you just debated in general. So you're more likely to err towards whoever's side like kind of matches your style, if that makes sense. So I think like if anything, like if competitors are like, oh, they don't really care about what we're saying about the warrants and stuff, like this is the value that they should take out of it because your judges are going to most likely vote on how they debated. Even if they're tabla rasa, like that's just gonna what's gonna end up happen.
Yeah, I think one thing, and this is like kind of a complicated point to make, but I think that yeah, like competitor driven makes a ton of sense. I think from a judge perspective, I think judges should be willing to be less technical. And I'll say this statement like I'll qualify it quite a bit because like obviously that's kind of like a bold claim. But what I mean by that is I think that like there isn't necessarily something wrong with you as a judge being like persuaded arbitrarily by the way people are articulating arguments or the fact that one team is calling out warrants in maybe a better way than another team. I don't think that's necessarily like bad. I think like a lot of the time, like this is very much based on like, how do you interpret a statement? Like, what do you consider to be reasonable-ish justification? And so like all of that can be kind of playing into it. And I think like it's okay to accept that. At the same time, I think when you're teaching debate, like from that perspective, like you should teach debate from the perspective of like you are appealing to a specific judge in the specific round, and so they have certain biases, they have certain like beliefs about like what they constitute as like a full argument or like arguments that they like already sort of maybe agree with. And so like when you're evaluating these claims, like I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say that, like, for example, substantiating something that like we might consider to be obviously true requires less of a standard than something that's more of a stretch. And that might change based on who the judge is, but I don't think that's necessarily like bad because like there is a level at which technical intervention is very important, very, very important. But I also think like in the pursuit of like perfect technical evaluation, we run into a whole bunch of like irresolvable problems. And so because of that, like, maybe we need to take a step back, to kind of go like one step back, two steps forward almost.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely understand what you're saying about these irresolvable problems. I kind of feel like the best model of tech debate is trying to balance the assumptions that the debaters have in the round, given what they've told you to do in the round, with like a set of facts that you think everyone agrees on. Like this is how people seem to warrant arguments to begin with, anyway. Like when do you know to stop warranting an argument? Because technically there's no line for it. You kind of have an intuitive feel for it based on a claim that would never be disputed, right? Like you keep warranting down until you get to a claim that you think the opponents will always agree with and the judge will always agree with, which is not always the case, right? Like, sometimes, like, for example, when we're making arguments about people dying, we assume death is bad, right? That's technically a claim that's disputable, and it happens in weird rounds sometimes. But it's we don't feel the need to warrant why death is a bad thing because we think that that is a claim that everyone will agree on. And so I think that if we don't agree on any of those claims, like I think skep arguments become kind of unbeatable. If you have a model of technical debate in which you say you have to prove warranting for like 100% for any argument to be true, and then you just have another team on the neg that's just, or whatever, the second speaking team, just asking why for every single claim you didn't warrant, it's impossible to win because there's always going to be claims that are disputable in some sense that weren't warranted in 4 minutes. It's impossible in an infinite amount of time to warrant all of those. And so I think if we have that model of tech debate, then it's sort of impossible to debate. We will never ever be debating the topic. We will just be debating skep, and then whoever initiates the skep debate or says presume their side will win, which seems like a bad kind of debate to have. So definitely needs some level of intervention to prevent that.
Yeah, I think one thing is that like, and I think one thing to maybe think about is like that intervention doesn't necessarily have to be entirely arbitrary. Like I think one thing that you mentioned that I like especially agree with is that it can be largely based on a set of assumptions that the debaters are operating under, or like the arguments made in the debate round. Um, like you don't necessarily have to like come to arbitrary conclusions based on just like taking bits of information and then like filtering them through your brain. Like you can take the information as is, and like and there can be some level of arbitrary evaluation, but you are using fundamentally the debater's arguments, words, and whatever they're warranting. But like, I think that like that's entirely possible. It's like difficult to do, and it's going to vary from judge to judge. But I think it is possible to like create a consistent set of like, um, you know, round strategies that you can replicate, where you do appeal to those kinds of things. Like like whether it's the words you're using or like the cards you're using, if you're highlighting more, and the judge is catching more, I think that's like, the debater has done a good job for ensuring that you catch more on your flow by warranting their argument more. If they are emphasizing their arguments better, like I think that's a good technical skill, like the ability to enunciate, for example. And these are all things that I think like you can do, in a way that's like effective. So I don't think it's like entirely arbitrary, to maybe like there is elements to it again, but I think that's inevitable. But I do think there's ways to get around that, without like fully, losing the value of technical debate.
I think this is why I always tell my students that they need to start agreeing with the other side on some things. I think that you've kind of illustrated exactly why that is such an important skill to have. It's not just important to be able to beat things that you might not have responses to. It's important to ground the judge's decision in a set of facts that they know both sides are agreeing on. The most objective way that you can win any round is if you don't dispute every fact, but if you lay out very clearly for the judge which things the opponents agree with you on, and then within that framework, which might be arbitrary, but it's agreed upon in this round, here's why we win. Like within the logical structure of this round, we are winning. And that seems to be like the cleanest way to win a technical debate, leaving the least possible up to intervention?
Yeah, I think one thing that I kind of want to add here is that like this also already somewhat happens. Like I think that maybe some judges like will hide it, but it does happen. Like inevitably as a judge, like we're all humans, right? And I think generally what you see is that like the most effective technical debaters often happen to do the things that we don't think count correctly. Like they're often the people who like the judge will like after hearing two speeches will be like, I'm just more like initially inclined to vote for this team because I liked their style, and maybe that's arbitrary. But it's something about like maybe how they enunciate their arguments or like the fact that they're reading diversified sets of responses or good quality evidence. And those kinds of biases do play a role. But I think it is telling that like, for example, like there is really good overlap between like teams that do well generally in terms of like lay debate or flay debate and teams that do well technically. It's not one to one for sure. And it never will be one to one. But like I think technically proficient debaters also happen to be persuasive. And so I think that like it's not necessarily a trade-off here. And that like the more you can get better at some of these, I'd say like soft skills, the better it's gonna pay off in close technical rounds, where the judge has to make close calls, has to make arbitrary calls. So I think like, one trend I've seen is that people like to like have very hyper technical practice rounds with like no judge. And so like the rounds will literally be going like insanely quick. There will be speech docs, and like you're not even listening to the speech, you're just looking at the speech docs. And then like midway through the round, because it's not a real round, you're asking the other person what they said. And that's not like replicating, I think, what a real round environment looks like, because it doesn't really emphasize or prioritize those soft skills that I think play a big role in winning close technical debates, where you maybe, even if you're going that fast, right, you just have a different person in the back of the room evaluating that debate. And so, like, I think if debaters focused more on that, you'll find that, like, even if it's not perfect and you don't exactly know why, and maybe the judge isn't saying why, like, they're just like voting on an argument, and you can't really determine why they did it. It likely could be influenced by those things. Like, for example, if a team has bad evidence practices, I think all of us would be kind of like, we kind of like raise our eyebrows and maybe not be as like willing to vote for them. Like maybe we would still would, but like you would maybe reduce their speaker points. Or in a close debate, maybe that means you like look at something else differently. And maybe that occurs subconsciously to some extent too. But getting good at those kinds of things also indirectly helps. Even if it's not coming out of like a judge's RFD, like a judge's RFD won't say like, oh, like you like didn't send any of your evidence and it took you 5 minutes to send your evidence. So like I was like not on your side for this debate. But like that is the case a lot of the time.
Yeah, like, and adding on to that, I've always said that K debate is just narrative debate. And I think, like, honestly, that should be the lesson that everyone should take. It's all about, like, being the more convincing person and putting up a performance that really, like, seals the deal for the judge. I think, like, the biggest thing that I think a lot of teams should shift towards is more judge instruction in, like, especially in Final Focus. So, what I mean by that is, like, don't, like, don't feel the need to mirror your partner's, like, summary. Like, honestly, like, I urge you to actually like identify the most important part of your argument and go all in on that argument and then just basically warrant out on why that impacts onto everything else that happens in the round. I think that is honestly so much more convincing than hearing you just like kind of retell what your partner just said, if that makes sense. Um, yeah, I think what Ishan is saying is totally right. Like more judge instruction and thinking about like how every part of the round like adds in ultimately to judges like RFD.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one more. Sorry, you can go, Ava.
Okay, sure. I think one thing that's also helpful for this from like the judge perspective is I think that judges need to be a little bit more honest about what actually like influences their biases and where they are intervening. Like at, NSC, there were a ton of rounds where either like I was judging or my kids were like debating where you could definitely tell that like the judge is there are certain things that are like persuading them other than just the arguments being read. And I think it's just helpful if judges can be honest about that so the debaters know how to like adapt. And to be honest, I think like probably like 95% of RFDs I've seen have some degree of judge intervention even when they're from technical judges. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's probably necessary for the evaluation of like the majority of rounds, but I do think the more that we can all kind of like be honest about where it happens, the more predictable RFDs become and like the easier it is for everyone to adapt.
What I was gonna say right before this, and this is like kind of veering a little bit off, but like it's connecting back to the progressive debate thing. I view like progressive debate, especially like in its sort of like developmental stage in public forum, where we're figuring out what works, what doesn't, as like technical lay debate for a lot of judges. Like it very much is like a large amount of the time it's an ethos game. Or if not an ethos game, it comes down to like even more arbitrary calls that judges have to make because like judges may have spent 4 years of their career debating substance and developing a set of like, heuristics or like, gut reactions to the way arguments develop. But then when they're confronting like these new and unfamiliar arguments, like it's an entirely new set of learning. And so like in many senses like it's very similar to the way lay judges approach things. And like yeah, like maybe you're operating with a bigger knowledge base or an understanding of the more technical components of debate. But that's why I'm going to call it technical lay debate. And a lot of progressive rounds. This can happen in K rounds, especially ones that rely on like emotional appeal, or like even theory rounds where you're like trying to maybe win an in-round abuse argument, or like you're trying to prove that their standard like or good is good enough, for example, when you're appealing to reasonability. And this is especially true, I think, given the place we are in public forum. I think that may change over time, but for the place we're in now, I think those skills like also come into play there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like when Ella and I were debating, we would only collapse on catharsis, and that was our whole entire argument. It was like a very emotional argument, and we like quite literally were appealing to everyone's like ethos. We weren't really focusing on like specific technicalities because theoretically, catharsis argument would kick out of every single argument that they made. It was all about like kind of convincing the judge that us staying in debate was super, super important, and it was also important for like other women to see like women win, or on top of that, like give them a survival strategy when they face like oppressive violence. Like that specific argument itself, it might not be the most technical, but it's probably the most like emotional in a round that is extremely emotional. And I totally agree with Ishan. It was basically technical they debate. Like Ella and I just did got really, really good at performing our critique. Like in Crossfire, we would act a specific way. Like during like prep time, we would also act specific ways. Like everything that we did was super intentional because the whole point is that we were convincing the judge, like, no, like this argument matters a lot. Like this argument is critical for debate. This is why like we should win. Like it all like plays a part. And I think a lot of people don't even realize like everything that Ella and I did like played a part into us winning rounds. But like that's truly what we did to help win. Like everything was thought out, if that made sense.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess to summarize all of this, seems like we all agree that intervention is inevitable. Judges should be more honest about that. But given that intervention is inevitable, what competitors can do is one, try to limit it as much as possible by operating within agreements in the round. And second, to skew that intervention their direction with these honing of soft skills as much as possible, even and maybe especially in some of the most like technical forms of debate that we think of, like Ks that rely on a lot of emotional appeal and judges might have less experience with. And so, yeah, I 100% agree with all of that. I think that there's too much of a separation, weird, like arbitrary line between tech debate and lay debate. And really, it seems to just be different sets of norms that are just being used in different ways to change the way that intervention happens, even though intervention sort of exists in both of those. Any concluding remarks on this discussion before we go to the new topic? Okay, let's do it then. So evidently we got the topic wrong. I'm sorry. There are like a million videos that you can look at that have me saying there's like a 99% chance that France is going to get picked. And to be fair, this is the first time in my like 9 years in PF that the camps have ever been wrong. I think it's happened before in history, but definitely a shock to everyone. But that's why we're here to discuss the new topic, which is about the UK rejoining the EU. At first glance, it seems like a very balanced topic to me. It seems like it's very rich in ground, very topical, lots of literature on both sides. So I want to just pick your brains on this a little bit. So the most basic question to start with is just like, what are your initial thoughts on the topic? And anyone can start.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of cheat and not directly answer the question you just said, at least yet. But I'm going to like say like what my thoughts are on like the topic changing, first of all. I think first of all, like there is like a decent amount of overlap with prep, like because Europe or whatever, but like not the point. I actually think it's kind of nice to have a new topic. Um, One because I think it's dangerous when you have like this like breeding ground of like very weird arguments at camp and this like flippiness pursuit. As Ava was mentioning, if six contention cases are at camp, like I wonder what's going to happen at the first like technical round of the year. And so like I think it's nice force a reset almost. And I think like given the pace at which PF is evolving, it is somewhat like deserving of a reset. so that people like should like they can go back to the drawing board and do that stuff again, but they're going to have to go through that process over and over again to achieve that. But I don't think it's necessarily bad. I am sympathetic to all the people though that obviously put a lot of time into it, but I don't think those skills are wasted. Like I think like obviously you're building up a good like you're learning how to write arguments, you're learning how to beat arguments, how to analyze evidence, like search terms that are likely relevant for this topic as well, and maybe like links and evidence that you can use for arguments on this topic too. So I don't think it's that bad. It could be worse. Is kind of
I
what I was.
completely agree with you. I'm so happy I don't have to judge the time travel argument round one of UK.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, you might have just jinxed yourself. So
That's
who
true.
knows?
That's true.
Who
Talk
knows?
about it, please. You know
Yeah.
our biases. We just talked
They're
about
gonna be like, no, they're gonna be like, we have to go back to Brexit and like undo it. This time it's like 10-year time travel.
but then T Re, right?
No, I get this. This makes sense. You go back in time, and then that's how you join the European.
Yeah. You got it. You got it.
Yeah. Okay, well then I'll leave a few remarks about what I think I think about the topic. I think one thing, well, I love topics that have a lot to do with implementation because I think that's always super interesting. And a lot of the times I think it's because you're never going to find one article that, answers the question directly posed by the resolution. And here there are like kind of some, which is kind of why I like the nuclear sharing topic to an extent because there is like a lot of stuff that you can do with fiat. I mean, I think here implementation is going to be huge. Like what does the process of Britain rejoining or the UK rejoining, the EU look like? Like what are the concessions it would have to make? Like what time? Like how long would it take? Another separate consideration. And then of course, right? Like there's obviously elements of like fiat and durable fiat coming into play, and I think that's also super interesting. And I think those involve like general theoretical considerations about debate that debaters might not have otherwise like considered. So I think like it's there with the nuclear sharing topic for sure, but it's kind of forced on you in this topic because there's only one real big thing happening, which is like the fact that it has to rejoin. So I like that element a lot. I think the neg like has a lot to do, that it can do with like the practical ramifications of rejoining the EU. I think a way I like to look at topics is like there is a way to view the topic in terms of like is if this happened, like if this happened just straight up, would it be good or bad? Like, would this policy result in good or bad things? In like a perfect world. And then there's like the world we live in. And then we have to like do this thing where we fiat the topic. And arguments about that, I think generally are pretty persuasive. And they're cool. I think they're creative. And I think there's a lot of room for that here. And so like I think that part is also super interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this topic is a lot more vague compared to the nuclear sharing one, so I think it leaves a lot for up to interpretation if that makes sense. I also like think that this will be more interesting to actually implement a little bit more of T arguments here. So like either that you have to defend that the UK rejoining means that they're going to rejoin with all the benefits rather than just for example maybe picking one or two benefits that are most likely going to happen.
Yeah, I know Ishan kind of mentioned this, but I think the part about the topic that's definitely most interesting is like the concessions. So, I'm working on or I recorded a topic analysis, so I had to do a ton of like research on like the history of like the UK and the EU. But I think the history of how they joined is pretty interesting in that they were able to negotiate pretty like massive opt-outs for themselves. And they also were kind of the country who set the trend that it was possible to join the EU with opt-outs, right? They were like kind of like the first people who were like, we're going to do this, but not all the way. And it goes back as far as I think like 1984 when they were able to get the rebate. So there's definitely like a lot of history there that I think is interesting. I know right now there are a ton of countries who have kind of said like they don't want the UK to join if they're just going to be like operating under their completely own set of rules and guidelines. So I think there's a lot that kind of I think it makes sense and it probably would be the most probable implementation if they were to have to concede to the entire demands of the EU. I think something that I've been researching that's very interesting there is them potentially joining like the Eurozone. I think that that gets you a lot more distinct links and probably kind of like magnifies the offense that all teams can get. I think the concession stuff is interesting, not because it skews the topic in either direction. I actually don't think it really affects like who can get ground. I think it just kind of means that there are like more possible arguments there, which I think is something that is kind of unique to this topic. I think the France topic was like pretty narrow in terms of what was actually supported by the literature, but I think there's definitely a lot more room here for creative arguments that aren't like totally made up, like time travel, for example, which I think is exciting and good.
I gotta say, I absolutely love this topic. I like it way more than the France topic. This might be a controversial opinion, but it seems like there's so much more literature. It's like got a very rich history. It's already something that sort of happened, and like people are talking about it. People are excited about talking about it. And I think there are tons of arguments on both sides. So I completely agree with all of the thoughts that have been shared, and I actually think I've distilled sort of like four questions from the thoughts that you've shared that I want to ask you about specifically. The first question is about those concessions, because I think this is, to your point, Ava, I think this is like a massive thing that a lot of arguments will hinge on. And I actually do think it changes the ground a little bit, but maybe we can get into that in a little bit. But I want to know, what do you think are the best arguments for why the UK would be granted concessions and what kinds? Or why they wouldn't be granted concessions. I'm aware that there's like the YouGov poll that says like most of the people in the heavy hitter EU countries like France and Germany, if you poll them, then they don't want the UK to join with their previous opt-outs. And as far as I'm aware, that's kind of the only evidence. I mean, I'm sure there's other stuff out there, but that's the only evidence I've seen so far that says the UK wouldn't be able to get its opt-outs. And a lot of other studies sort of referencing that one. But I was wondering, yeah, like, how debatable do we think this is? Do you think there's a line to be taken that says, like, actually, no, we don't have to adopt the euro, and here's why?
Yeah, I think it is pretty debatable. I think another reason for why they would have to join without any opt-outs is like the Copenhagen criteria, which is laid out in the Maastricht Treaty. And one of the kind of like things you like the prerequisites to having your application approved is that you need to fully accede to like all EU policy areas. So I think that that's kind of an argument that can be made. I'm not entirely sure what the argument for the UK getting concessions looks like, but I imagine it would have something to do with the fact that like the UK is the one whose action is being fiated. So maybe there's something to do there with the fact that like because the UK is the one who initiates the process, that makes it more likely that they would be able to get like some kind of concessions. I'm not entirely sure how that would work, but I think the UK being the primary actor is something that people should be exploring.
That's interesting. I kind of actually have the opposite intuition. Like, my thought is like, if it were worded the opposite, like if it was like the EU should let the UK in, or the EU should like get the UK to rejoin or something, then I feel like it would be more like the EU is offering like carrots for the UK to join. But given that it's like the UK should join, I don't know. I feel like I interpret that more as the UK should join in whatever way is necessary for it to join. So, i.e., the UK should join, should do whatever it can to get the EU to unanimously approve its rejoin, which means giving up opt-outs. Um, but yeah, other thoughts on opt-outs?
I think one thing maybe, and this is like, I don't know, maybe you can play around with like the word rejoin. Maybe that necessarily implies. Like, I don't know. Maybe something there, but I think that like as a broader perspective, I think arguments that are obviously about the mandate of the resolution will beat anything about the most probable implementation of the resolution. So I don't think you should be afraid to get creative with finding definitions and being able to substantiate them because that's going to beat a well-reasoned argument for what most probably will occur if like you can just win that the mandate of the resolution doesn't care. So there's that.
That's interesting. I feel like, what if there are multiple valid definitions of rejoin? Then does it just become which one is most probable, or do you have to debate about like the debatability and stuff of each of them?
Think you could make a case for either, honestly. But I would love to see that debate, like if it occurs. I think with like two sides that have clearly thought about this, I think it would be make for an interesting discussion. But I mean, I think there's arguments everywhere here that you can sort of play around with.
Yeah, something like more general about that that I think is kind of an issue that I think needs to be resolved in PF is the fact that people will very much debate it like it's whole res. So like for example, like on the France topic, like, the AF could get up and say that it's just going to be like some kind of symbolic agreement, and the NEG could get up and say that we're going to deploy nukes in the Baltics. And I think that in PF, it's kind of consensus that the AF team doesn't get to go up there and be like, no, not our AF, not what we're defending, which means like the NEG can garner disadvantages off of a different implementation than what the AF garners their advantages off of. So I think that PF kind of gets to an interesting location where I think it would be possible for both sides to get offense off of like their definition of rejoin. And it would almost just become like an average debate where each team is debating a slightly like different resolution. I think that's like a hole that needs to be patched, but I think that it should be up to debaters to kind of like innovate the best way out of that.
I mean, my guess is that that debate just looks like, Team A gets up and says rejoin means no opt-outs, and here's why. Team B says no, it does mean opt-outs, and here's why. And then that becomes its own debate, right? Like, because those can't simultaneously be true. Like, unless you have, I guess, like one team could say, listen, there's a 50-50 chance that each of us is right about what the word rejoin means. So you should like weight each argument by 50% and then like pretend that there's two resolutions happening at once. But I think that that's a little bit silly. So I would imagine that the judge resolves that by just looking at like who wins that their implementation is more likely in most cases. But I feel like there's so many different ways to prove that your implementation is likely.
Oh yeah, I think for sure there are like tons of ways to do it. One thing that this like a thought that I just had is like I don't know if you all have seen the optical illusion where like someone is spinning and it's like is it spinning the right way or the left way? I think like you can very much look at this topic sort of this way when you like think about it like as who's holding the gun to the other's head. That's kind of how I think about fiat. Like something has to get done. So is it the UK saying we're gonna join no matter what, or like it's gonna happen? Like there is some almighty power that's making it happen. And so like we're not gonna take your nonsense, and it's like the EU is just more likely to keep. I don't really know, but like is the EU holding the gun? But like they have to join no matter what. So like who's operating with what information? I don't know. But you can see it spinning maybe both ways in that sense. It's like how much power does fiat have, I guess, and like are the countries aware like of this like requirement, this like requirement from God that the UK has to rejoin the European Union, and then they have to like figure out how they're going to satisfy that requirement. I don't know, but like I think you can look at it definitely in different ways.
I think something else that I think debaters should try to do is like, obviously we're all kind of unsure of like what the most probable implementation would be. So I think you should just make arguments about like why that aren't based on like probability in terms of why your interpretation of the resolution is like best for debate. That aren't just based on like this is like likely what would happen. I think that there are like a lot of good tea debates that happen in other events that aren't solely based off of like the most probable implementation. And I think that debaters should try to kind of get creative with warrants for why their interpretation is like more debatable and something that should be more debatable.
I have a
Yeah.
hot take on this, but I'll let Fiona go first.
Well, I guess like adding on to that, I think you can also like argue like what's fair in the round and what isn't fair, if that makes sense. Like for example, um I don't know, expecting the AF to defend all benefits is fair because like that's what is assumed by the name of rejoin. And it just becomes like a regressive debate slowly by like taking out specific benefits or specific parts that they're not going to do within the EU. And that itself would regress the debate space as a whole. I think that itself could be really interesting to watch and also see how that evolves rather than just like sticking to like what is the most probable implementation.
Okay, my hot take, which will address both of the things that you just said, is I think that debates about predictability are always worse for deciding the interpretation of the resolution than debates about like the actual precision of the words in the resolution or like what would actually happen. Like my thought on this is just like maybe the resolution is unfair, but it's the resolution, right? Like if I prove that this is what is actually what the topic actually would do, and that this is the best, like the most accurate or the most precise way to determine what the topic is, and then you're like, well, that's unfair. I feel like the answer is just like, okay, then take it up with the people who wrote the topic. Like they wrote an unfair topic, so I'm gonna use that to win. And maybe it's like an uneducational topic too. Maybe the topic sucks, but it's the topic we have, and it's predictable that I should be able to define it this way because this is what the topic actually would be. And if you, I think there's like a slippery slope. Like if you allow yourself to start veering off course and say like, well, here's a slightly more fair interpretation of the topic that does break, maybe it takes out one of the words, but it's more fair. Like, couldn't we just replace all of the words and make it like infinitely more fair and have like the most fair, the best topic in the world? It's like the most educational that deals with like way more pressing real world concerns. And then I mean, some people would say, yes, we should do that. And like, that's a justification for certain non-topical Ks as well. But my intuition is like, no, like the topic has some importance. And I think that that importance, like the precision of what the topic actually means, should almost always categorically trump the debatability of the topic.
I think that's fair to say, but I think like a couple of things I would say is like one, if the committee inherently made an unfair argument, then it's good for us to prove that it's unfair in this round so then the committee learns from their mistakes and then they can correct it. I think that's the first intuitive response I would make. I think the second thing is like it wouldn't be necessarily a slippery slope, but rather you actually defend the resolution as a whole because we're saying that you're misinterpreting the word rejoin and this is the best definition for it instead that is most fair for the round because then like for example like there's a lot of people use prep time as an example, so I'm just gonna use that. Like, there's only such like limited amount of prep time that we have, so we can't be expected to come up with X, Y, and Z amount of prep compared to whatever argument that you just made that just didn't really fit under the resolution itself. And I think there's also like a question of like if it doesn't fall under the resolution in our interpretation, then we can make an argument that it's unfair for us to even be talking about it in the first place because this is not something that we're expected to debate, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, I get the slippery slope argument. But I think like either way, like it's either one, like the committee made it unfair topic, which then is honestly good for us to check back on that to make sure that they don't do that again. Or B, we just have to prove that it's not a slippery slope, if that makes sense, that like you did fall outside of the resolution.
Yeah,
But
that makes sense. I guess to clarify, like I agree with you completely on this predictability stuff. I think that's why I would say the precision trumps debatability because like if if I prove that I'm correct about what the topic actually means, then it's completely unfair for you to gain offense off of something that I couldn't have known is the topic because I'm the one who's correct about the topic.
yeah,
Um, but
I
yeah,
think that's a better way to word it than what I was trying to word it as, but yeah.
sure. I don't know. I think that the point you were making about like pointing it out to the wording committee is interesting. My intuition is just like, don't punish me for that, right? Like we could probably point it out to the wording committee without like me losing the round because I interpreted it correctly.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess my point is like if mo more people lose to this shell, then like obviously they'll have to pay attention to it, the problem that they made. I don't know. This is just coming as someone who read case and had to face this problem a
Yeah,
lot.
that makes sense. That makes sense.
I think one way that you can maybe also think about it in like a similarly analogous sense is like how would you want a rule interpreted? Like a rule, like an NSDA rule. Would you want it to just be like the rule is what it is and we should interpret it to the best of our ability based on what it says or what we think it should, like what's the fairest? I think the fairest like can be more dangerous in that sense. But I also don't think like necessarily topic and rule is one to one. But I think that perspective also is interesting, right? Because like if you're looking at it from like a rules, just simply rules based perspective, I think it's not, it's like kind of, you probably do want it interpreted the way that what the rule actually says is. And you shouldn't be penalized for following the rule, even if it's not in our best interest. And that largely follows how like society works too, right? Like, if a law is bad and you openly choose and you follow the law, like imagine getting punished because people decided that the law should not exist. Like so that's I think another perspective you can take on this. In another, analogous or example way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Mac in terms of why the like precision stuff is important. I think that in practice though those debates are kind of like difficult because if each side is trying to warrant out like why their like precise interpretation of the topic is the one that's actually like the closest to like what the topic committee like intended or like semantics or whatever, I think that a lot of the time is like very difficult to warrant. I think that's something that I think is probably kind of like a good way to break the tie there is just like clash, like which interpretation is better for clash. I think that kind of falls in line with like what did like the topic committee intend, right? Because it's like they probably want a topic where like both sides have equal chances of winning, where there's like a lot of literature, a lot of ground for research, whatever. Like they're the NSDA, that's like the purpose of debate. So I think that that's something that debaters should kind of be looking to break the tie because like yes, we all agree that precision is important, but like, how do you debate what is the most precise? I think that it's kind of like tautological and that you need to have like the justifications for like why having the topic that way is important, and it gets kind of like confusing. But I think the debaters can like try to employ that.
That's really interesting. I hadn't considered that. Like maybe debatability is evidence of this being the correct interpretation in terms of precision. Yeah, I totally buy that as a tiebreaker for sure. Speaking of rules and interpretations, I have a second question for all of you that is very wild, but there's no rule that says that the topic is immediate. So my question is, could a most probable implementation of this topic? We heard the time travel arguments in the past. Could we do it in the future? Like it seems like the public opinion polls in the UK are consistently trending toward every year people are getting the younger voters are getting older and they're starting to vote. So every year we're getting closer and closer to a politically viable circumstance for the UK to rejoin. And in the meantime, the UK seems to be slowly getting closer to allowing the UK to maybe have more opt-outs in the future, but like not right now. So my question is like, could I, on the pro or on the con for that matter, be like most likely interpretation of the resolution is that it happens in like 3 years, and that's when the fiat actually occurs because there's no time frame specified in the resolution. It's just like it should happen.
Honestly, yeah, I think so. Like, if you find like a piece of evidence that says it's gonna be 3 years because I don't know, like younger voters need to have the chance to age and vote, then I think that's honestly a valid take. As long as there's like a piece of carded evidence that's like well warranted and implicated out, then I can see myself voting off of that.
Yeah, there actually is a card that I found that said it might happen in 10 years.
I mean, I think that you could, but I'm a little like skeptical about it for two reasons. I think the first is that just from like a political viability perspective, I'm pretty sure that the polling like already shows a majority in the UK being willing to like rejoin the EU. And so if the UK is the one who's fiating it, I think like it probably is like politically viable right now. But I think like the second kind of like logical answer is that like, okay, if people are saying like it's probably going to happen in 10 years, then like what is the unique like what is uniquely debatable about the topic if it's something that is like inevitably going to happen, right? Which I think is like weird in PF because there are topics that are things that have already happened and it just kind of like benefits versus harms. But I think it kind of gets into like a weird spot because it's like, well, why are we fiating something if we're saying that it's just inevitably going to happen? I think the other thing is I think the neg can definitely make arguments about the fact that like a lot of their ground is probably premised on the fact that authors are like assuming it gets like implemented now. So I don't think those like fairness arguments are great, but I think there's probably like a pretty decent clash argument there that like you're not actually able to test like the validity of the AF if authors are making the assumption that it passes now. I think in terms of the time frame debate, I think there are valid ways the AF can delay the time frame debate. I don't think they would be political viability though. I think it would probably just look more like the process of a country joining the EU is like really, really long, especially if in the context of debate, we all agree there may or may not be concessions. Those take like a pretty long time to get ironed out. So I think there are probably arguments that just like normal means requires like a decade or so before anything like actually happens.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess to just clarify for the first point, you were saying like if it's inevitable, why fiat? The stance that I would take is like, who cares about fiat? It's a made up concept. What we're debating is whether or not this should happen. So it doesn't matter if it's inevitable or if it's not inevitable. It's just a question of if it would be good if it happened. So maybe it will happen. We still have the same question. Would that be good? Like when it happens, will it be good? Will that be a good decision? Right. So I think that this is one of those weird like policy inherency stock issues that doesn't necessarily map cleanly onto PF. And it's possible to debate should statements that don't have any inherency.
Yeah, I have two additional thoughts here. The first is that like I think people like could take the like should is immediate route, but I think the evidence that says should is immediate is like quite bad. And like this is also like part of like the policification of PF stuff, but like I implore you like seriously consider why should means immediate. And like read the evidence, like because it really doesn't do anything closest to, I guess the reason it's accepted is because like it makes like some both sides can benefit from should being immediate. And like it's kind of like established as a thing, like should being immediate, but like it really probably isn't immediate. Um, the other thing I'll say is that I think like when you're like looking at like what's most likely to take place, I think you also have to consider that there's a separate question here. Like that's not the question like that the resolution's asking. It's like what's most likely to take place in a world where fiat exists. So I think that like if we know the UK is rejoining the European Union, Like maybe that modifies like a card that says like the most likely way the UK would rejoin the European Union in the world as it currently exists is it's a 10-year long process of back and forth negotiating. And then maybe you could say fiat could speed up parts of that element or elements of that. There's maybe an argument there. But I do think just generally like evidence is obviously not probably not going to consider fiat. So you could play around with that.
That's interesting. My like interpretation of how fiat works in PF is that we can read the resolution as like an if-then statement. Like if the UK rejoined the EU, then that would be good. And then that kind of entails obviously that we think about the most likely way that the UK actually would rejoin the EU. And in that sense, I don't know how much that interpretation of a resolution like grants you fiat to accelerate things, like just thinking linguistically about it. Like if someone asks me like if the UK rejoined the EU, I don't know. I can see both though. Like I can see like I would immediately think that will happen soon. But I could also see like it doesn't have to. I don't know. I don't know. It's weird stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you. The way I teach fiat is like the same. I teach it as an if-then statement. Like it's like if it occurs, then would it be good or bad? But I do think that it's not so like uh, just like something that like just so established that you can't necessarily contest the way it operates. Um, but if I were to pick a side to stay on, I'd probably just land where you are.
Okay, I have a third question for everyone. Um, this is another weird one. How are you feeling about general practical solutions on this topic? My intuition is that they actually might be quite powerful, especially on the con side, where you can say if the pro says, for instance, that we need to rejoin the EU because it will solve this one specific agreement for space cooperation. Seems like general practical solution. If everyone's like down to do space cooperation, just do space cooperation now without rejoining the EU or something. And maybe if they aren't down to do it, then it's not practical and it's not general because it's too specific if it's only about space. But these kinds of arguments, I think, might be powerful in certain scenarios used on the con and could even be used on the pro as well. If you say like general practical solution, I don't know, like negotiate and give a bunch of concessions to the EU to allow to get them to give you this opt out or something.
I think the first step here is buying into generalized practical solutions, which I'm not sure if I'm all the way there yet.
They're in the
Um,
rules.
sure, yeah, yeah. I'm not sure if I'm all the way there yet. Um, because I think it turns on what general and practical means, which in context maybe it means something different, but I'm also not dismissive of them. Which I think more people like if you just like kind of scoff at generalized practical solutions, don't because like it's not going to help you, and also like maybe you'll find that you do end up agreeing with it. I think that generally that's a good approach to take with debate. Like just don't treat anything like you should be more there should be a level of humility there. And I'm admitting that there is a level of humility here, but also I'm not sure I'm all the way there yet. Because like just because of what actually becomes generalized and practical, and what qualifies as that. And I think another thing is like if the solution truly is generalized and practical, maybe it won't necessarily solve the problem. I don't know, maybe. Like for example, if you said just engage in space cooperation, like maybe you could just say that that is like kind of hollow, or would take place in a sort of hollow manner, and it requires a sort of like a tethering that the resolution like attaches to it that then like makes it effective. So I think there are ways to debate it. But I think this is a great topic to explore that. Like, should you buy into generalized practical solutions slash want to make arguments about them? Like, I think this is a great topic to do that because there are a lot of individually small problems that like probably don't require joining the EU to solve. I think one thing that I've come across a lot on this topic is like when I'm looking up like problems associated with Brexit. If an author is talking about a solution, the solution is most likely not rejoining the European Union. It's something a lot like shorter of that because obviously that's it's more realistic in the real world. And so like I think there's plenty of literature out there that talks about how like X problem exists and like that probably is going to be featured in a lot of evidence. Like Brexit created this problem. And then the card will stop there. But later on in the card, it will propose a solution to that problem that is short of rejoining the European Union. So I think there is an angle you can go there, a route you can take there.
Before we move on, I feel the need to clarify my stance on general practical
Okay.
solutions because I think I've gotten slandered a little bit on this. Um, I don't think they're very powerful at all. So in debate, we already acknowledged that there's the existence of like very easy impact mitigation, for example, where you say like this impact might happen, but it's probably very easy to solve, and so it likely will be solved without the AF. For example, right? Like if there's this thing that seems really stupid that they're saying is going to happen if we do nothing about it and like doing anything about it will solve, the go-to response I would have is just like, okay, it seems like probably someone will just solve that then, and then there's no need for this. There's like other ways that we can solve this, and someone probably will do those things if it gets this bad. I see general practical solutions as just a way to grant you access to that response without having evidence. To say, like, this is a little tiny nugget of fiat that we're giving you, just so that you can say, if there's a problem that is incredibly easy to solve, and it likely will be solved, you don't need to prove the likely part. In practice, you still do, because that's kind of what it means to be general and practical, right? Like any response that they would give to it being likely also is a response to it being generalized and practical. Because if they say it's unlikely, any reason that it is unlikely is a reason it's impractical as a result. But if they don't have any reason why it's unlikely, and you have a reason why like it would be a very easy solution, then I think this just grants you that like it pushes you over the edge to prove that this will happen. Um, Through some sort of baby fiat. And so ultimately what it means is it should only work as defense against really bad arguments that are really easy to solve. It's just like a burden that your impacts or that your scenario has to overcome. That's just like any problem that you're addressing has to be not super trivially easy to solve, basically.
I wondered, maybe just to bounce this back at you, how do you prove that something is trivially easy to solve, I guess? Like, where do you draw that? I guess that's my, I think, biggest worry with it. I think there are things where I can just be like, yeah, that is trivially easy, but if you ask like 10 people, I don't think 10 people would agree.
Yeah.
Wonder what the standard is there.
So I can think of two off the top of my head. I think I made a video that has like a few more, but I don't remember them all. One way to do this is to literally just like have definitions for general and practical. You can appeal to judge intuitions as well. I think what you need to do is just be like, this is general and practical, and it's obvious. And then I think, honestly, in most of these rounds, I think it should be the opponent's burden to respond. But I think that's a very low burden. Like, I think it is incredibly easy to prove that something is not general or is not practical. And I think that if that's a debate that you're having about whether or not it's practical, it's probably not practical. Like, if there's like a legitimate reason why it's impractical, then I think that is probably sufficient to disprove its practicality. I think this is really not a very powerful tool, except against very fake arguments, of which there just happen to be many.
I guess like my opinion on it is like if the solution is that general and practical, like why isn't it happening now? And if it's already happening now, then just like read evidence and be like, okay, like alternative thing that solves it. Which I think is like probably like I don't know. That's just like my opinion on it. I also am someone who like the concept of like neg fiat in PF like literally has never like gotten through to my brain. Like I don't even understand why like K's can like have alts in PF. Like it's like which is like probably my own fault, but like I just like genuinely do not
It's not, it
understand
doesn't
how
make
that like
sense.
works at
I
all.
promise.
So like the thought that like they can just get up there and be like, okay, but like what if we did this other thing? It's like, yeah, like what if, but like you're not doing it. And like if you are doing it, like why? I don't know. Maybe that's just my own problem, but I think like if the solution is really that good, then like it should be happening right now. And the fact that it's not happening right now kind of proves that it's either not general or not practical. So it's just kind of gets like circular, is like probably how I would respond to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very good response people should use against general practical solutions. But there are two circumstances in which it doesn't apply, both of which are just future circumstances, right? So on the AF, if you're reading uniqueness that says something will happen, then the general practical solution follows it, right? You would just say that the evidence of the solution not preempting the problem is not evidence that the solution won't occur after the problem or when the problem would occur according to your uniqueness. Like if we get to a point where Russia legitimately might invade, then this general practical solution probably will happen. And we also can fiat that with our little baby general practical solution fiat. Same on the neg, right? Like obviously disadvantages of the resolution are things that have not happened in the status quo because the resolution has not happened in the status quo, which means it's insufficient to say that these solutions haven't happened yet. You would just say, well, okay, but the resolution hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, for sure. I think that with that, something that I think teams can do other than just like a generalized practical solution is just like it, like for Russia, for example, right? Like, okay, have there been times in the past where Russia is close to invading and like what did countries do to solve it? And just kind of use that as like the guideline for it. I also think that makes like your generalized practical solution something that judges are a lot more willing to buy is if you're just like, okay, like here's like what like this like task force or this military action that was taken, like it's probably likely that it gets like taken again. I think the other thing that kind of confuses me is like if generalized practical solutions don't have evidence, like how do they get like solvency? It's kind of like counterplans without solvency advocates, where I just personally am like not a huge fan of them because I feel like if you know there's such a high burden on the app to prove that like their solution of like the resolution being implemented like is true via like evidence and whatnot. I feel like the neg should have to like at least read a card that like this thing does resolve the issue.
Yeah, I think one take that I have here that just like maybe affects I don't think it necessarily affects the viability of them, but I think it's more a prediction of how they would take place. I think that like they're a dangerous tool because I feel like the inclination is going to be to attach a generalized practical to solution to stuff that is more than I think trivially easy to solve. And I wonder what that would look like more practically. If debaters like were rushing to them and then like imagine like throwing them out as blips, right? Maybe replicating part of the blip problem. I don't think that's necessarily a fault with generalized practical solutions as much it is kind of reflective of like the tendencies of debaters. But I can envision a world where if that were like a normalized thing, that like that could also be something that occurs. But I also don't think that that's necessarily a reason why it uh, shouldn't be a viable thing.
Yeah, point taken. I can imagine. I think they already are being misused. So I think there's like 100% evidence that they will be misused, which is very sad. And honestly, if we're being like really real for a second, I think I might just agree that like on net, generalized practical solutions being used will be bad, because of the potential for them to be misused. Uh, but it pains me to say that because I also think that they are in the rules and they do make sense and like they they could be something that is used correctly that improves debate by like being a threshold that fake scenarios have to overcome that just filters out like really fake arguments that you don't immediately have evidence and cards against. But yeah, we'll see. Unfortunately, it might just be a slippery slope to like the fakest counterplans we've ever heard of. Okay, I have a fourth question for everyone. Question four is, um, oh yes, durable fiat. Do we think Brexit 2.0 is a legitimate argument on the neg? Like, I don't know, there will be some sort of replacement of the UK Parliament, or there will be some other circumstance that arises, and then eventually the UK will leave the EU again.
Um, I think probably, but I'm not entirely certain that it's necessary. I think you can kind of get most of the like benefits of fiat not being durable by just saying like okay like the UK is just going to like block this or they're going to like refuse to be a part of this initiative or like there I think there's also arguments that like the EU Parliament would become very like anti EU if they see it like expanding and they would just like block all EU action. So I would kind of encourage debaters to like tease that out first, see if it's viable, because like I think a lot of judges are probably just going to go in with like the assumption that fiat is always durable. And it's something that I think is hard to disprove, especially in like a PF round where the speech times are so short. So like if you can find a way to get all like the benefits of fiat not being durable without like having to put that burden on yourself, I think that that's probably like just easier for everyone to accomplish.
Yeah, my take on it is I think durable fiat is good. And largely it should like be in place, as in that I don't think like a Brexit 2.0 under like assuming Brexit 2.0 means like that they like literally just leave is a thing. But I do think that you can play around with what like a version of a Brexit 2.0 that isn't an official Brexit. Like I don't think there's like a spirit of a Brexit. Like I don't think there's a spirit of durable fiat argument. I think like it's the resolution stays in place, but you can like Any way that you can get around that, sure, fair game. Like so I don't think that, you can appeal to like if there was a version of Brexit that like involves them being in the EU, but kind of reverts them to like maybe a status that is like equivalent to maybe a pre-Brenter world. I think that's fair game. Because like as long as like it stays in place, like the likely implement, I think it's just an extension of what the likely implementation is. So as long as you accept the idea that the like UK will be in the EU, as long as that's accepted, you can do whatever you want to what that actually means, even if that means like a watered down version of them being in the EU or them being like ceremonially in the EU. Like I think that's all fair game.
Yeah, I think the reason why I like kind of hesitated in terms of like is durable fiat like applicable is I think that on this topic, fiat not being durable is something that's like actually grounded in the literature. Like you can find very like qualified sources who are saying that like Brexit 2.0 is like a likely outcome of the AF happening. And so I'm hesitant that we should just like scrap that because I think my philosophy on debate is very much like follow like where like the qualified sources are. And like if that's what they're saying, then like, okay, maybe there is some merit to it. I think my concern with that though is like how does it apply to other topics? Because I think like we've probably all seen durable fiat being abused where people are like, oh, if there's like a nuclear sharing agreement, the nukes are going to get stolen and then like they're going to unshare them because they don't want like the terrorists to have the nukes. And it's like, okay, like that's just all kind of like analytic assertions. But I think there's definitely like an interesting debate to be had in terms of like if the literature base says that Brexit 2.0 is possible, like what does that actually mean for our like debatability purposes?
Yeah, I agree with Ava on this. I think if there's like evidence and like the evidence is good and you can debate it, then it's fair game. And on top of that, like if it proves that like, oh, okay, the resolution itself is not a good thing, then I think it's worth having. I also agree with Ava that I think it can be abused by just, like an analytical assertion is not the same thing as evidence. If there's evidence, then go ahead and debate it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I see both positions a lot. My intuition on this, though, is I think durable fiat, there's an interpretation of durable fiat that exists in which Brexit 2.0 is allowed. If you interpret durable fiat to mean just that the conditions that currently prevent Brenter from happening will go away, will be permanently overcome, right? Like, I don't know, the parliament that currently exists will completely agree and they won't like immediately turn back around and like leave. Then, of course, fiat is durable, those conditions persist. But if there's an exogenous shock that happens post fiat that is different from the things that currently prevent the resolution from happening, I think that's fair game, right? Like if there's a change in which majority is in parliament as a result of a general election that happens after the AF, I think it's okay to say that that would reverse the policy. And just linguistically for a second, if we're debating like outside of structured public forum debate, if we're just talking about whether or not something should happen, I think in day-to-day conversation, people don't assume this interpretation of durability. They do assume some interpretation of durability. Like if you ask someone if the US should invest in nuclear energy, they won't turn around and be like, no, they shouldn't, because if they invest, then they'll immediately uninvest because they don't like investing or something. Like no one does that, right? Like there is an assumed durable fiat that exists in day-to-day conversations, and it doesn't include extreme versions of durable fiat that would prevent this argument from happening, right? Which is why we see it in the literature base, right? I think this is evident in the fact that if you have like a lay round on this topic, I think it would be terrible strategy to say like durable fiat against a Brexit 2.0 argument. I think that the lay judge probably, even if you explain it, probably would have intuitions that go against you because the statement should doesn't necessarily imply that, and it's definitely debatable. So that's my thought on it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it very much circles back to like what is your definition of fiat? Like, is fiat like an if-then statement that removes some kind of like external barriers? Is it literally just like assuming that something passes and passes like immediately? I think the other kind of like nuance here is I think we all have like a pretty good understanding of what fiat means in like domestic topics where it's like a bill that's being passed. But I think that in terms of like international actor fiat, I don't think the community has really like established norms there. And I think that like what you interpret fiat to mean like definitionally informs whether or not it is durable because like yeah. So I think that that's something that's like exciting that there could definitely be pretty solid debates over.
For sure. Any concluding thoughts on our discussion today about the topic or just more broadly before we uh, end this for the night? Okay, well, thank you all for being here and for having a very rich conversation, both about how PF is evolving and the new topic. I'm sure that we'll have you back on the channel somewhat soon to continue these kinds of conversations. And thank you again for being part of the Argument Institute. You should sign up if you're watching this. There's still time, and we have a great coaching staff. So excited for the season ahead. See you guys later.